Greetings, salutations, respect, and love. I am Scott. Welcome to the Prog Corner, where today it's part 5 of the top 100 prog bands of all time. Yeah, we're going to be doing the top 20 today. It's the conclusion, the culmination, the climax of what we've been building up to here, and the excitement is palpable. Yeah, brief rundown on the criteria we're using here. Strength of discography, longevity, influence, impact and innovation, commercial and critical success, overall progginess, and of course, my subjective, totally biased opinion about this. You know, as we run down this final 20, you're going to notice a few big bands that were not on this list: Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Queen, Wishbone Ash, Traffic, Chicago, 10cc, XTC, Bebop Deluxe, Steely Dan, Steel Eye Span, Fairport Convention, Argent, Jellyfish, Radiohead, not on there. And I'm going to give you my final 5 that were left off, sadly left off this list. This is just how strong the competition was here. Starcastle, Happy the Man, Dixie Dregs, Anyone's Daughter, Pain of Salvation. Apologies to them. They almost made it in, but that's how strong the competition is here. And without any further ado, let's do this thing. It's number 20. We're going to France. Band formed in 1969 in Paris by a guy named Christian Vander, a classically trained musician who was also a drummer. They originally were going to call themselves Uniwira Zect Magma Composidra Argusdra. I'm glad they just shortened that to Magma. These guys not only created their own subgenre, but they created their own language years and years before Sigur Rós did the same trick. Their debut came out in 1970, 1001 degrees Celsius in 71, but I'm spotlighting their 1973 masterpiece, Mechanic Destructu Commando. Also really, really cool was 1974's Kontarkos, which was an album that was suggested to me in our obscure album series. Really cool stuff. This is where my criteria came in. If I was just picking my top 100 bands, or my favorite 100 bands rather, Magma probably wouldn't be in there, but their influence, their impact, it's just amazing how many bands have formed because of this Magma creation. I had a hard time getting into them, but in 2019, they released an album called Zest, and I was really impressed by it, so I actually went back and started listening to all their other stuff, including 1984's Mercy, which was their entree into more pop type of stuff. Cool band, really cool band. They deserve to be in the top 20, absolutely. At number 19, we're going to the Netherlands and Focus. This is a band formed by Thies van Leer. He was joined by the great Jan Ackerman on guitar. They still have their original drummer in the band, which is Pierre van der Linden. Their first album came out in 1970, Focus Plays Focus. It was okay, but man, they got real good real quick. Their second album, Moving Waves, had that weird hit, Hocus Pocus, on it with all the weird yodeling and stuff, but that album was actually more than just that single. It was terrific. Focus 3 came out in 72. It had another hit, Sylvia, and then 1974, Hamburger Concerto. Those 3 albums are amazing. Their last 2 are really good also. Focus 10 came out in 2012, and Focus 11 in 2018. Both really good records. Check them out. At number 18, we're going to Sweden and the Flower Kings. Yeah, Roine Staalt's been around forever. He was in that band Kappa in the 70s. Then in the 80s, he was trying to do some solo stuff. But the early 90s came around and he felt the time was right to do a progressive rock album. So he did a solo album called The Flower King. It did better than expected. So when he went to flesh out the band with touring members, it became a real band whose first album came out in 1995 with Back in the World of Adventures. Their third album, 1997's Stardust We Are, considered by many to be their best. I really like 1999's Flower Power. There's a 60-minute epic on there called Garden of Dreams. If you like Yes, if you like the more positive, flowery, kind of, post-hippie type of prog, the Flower Kings are probably going to be a band that you love. They lost a couple members. Thomas Bodine, the original keyboard player, no longer in. So they recruited a new keyboard player. They got a new drummer. And they put out 3 terrific albums with this lineup. 2019's Waiting for Miracles, 2020 Islands, and this past year by Royal Decree. Just amazing. Yeah, this band just is so good. Their discography is so deep. They've never put out a bad album. At number 16, we're going to Italy and PFM, the absolute kings of the Italian prog scene. They were formed in Milan in the mid-60s doing, Italian pop things. You had Franco Musita, Flavio Primoli, and Franz Di Ciogio, who is the only remaining member. PFM is still going. It was when the guy from Dalton, the guy named Muro Pagani, joined the band that things really gelled together. His violin just really gave them a really cool sound. Early PFM gigs included cover songs by Jethro Tull, King Crimson, The Flock, and Chicago, which is just kind of weird. They dropped their first album, 1972, Storia di un Minuto, amazing. That same year, Pur and Amico came out. And then Greg Lake discovered them. They got signed to Manticore. They put out an English album with Pete Sinfield from King Crimson doing the lyrics called Photos of Ghosts. 1974, they put out their third album, La Sola di Niente. They did the same thing, put out an English version of it called The World Became the World. And then they hired an English singing guy named Bernardo Lanzetti, who had spent some time in the U.S., so his English was good. In 75, they did the Chocolate Kings. 77, they did Jet Lag. And then they started getting a little more commercial, like every other prog band in the world in the 80s. Last year, they just dropped a great album called I Dream of Electric Sheep with guest musicians Ian Anderson and Steve Hackett. It's really great. PFM's amazing. At number 16, it's Porcupine Tree. Yeah, formed by Steven Wilson in 1987 as a solo project. This band has gone through a few permutations. The early stuff was kind of psychedelic. Then he decided he'd bring in a full band, so he hires Chris Maitland, Colin Edwin, and Richard Barbieri. And they kind of went into their melodic phase. They got signed, put out some good records like Signify in 96, Stupid Dream in 99, Lightbulb Sun in 2000. But then the change really happened when they added Gavin Harrison on drums. And then the next 3 albums are just incredible. 2002's In Absentia, 2005 Dead Wing, 2007 Fear of a Blank Planet. They just dropped their 11th album this year, Closure Continuation, without Colin Edwin, so they're down to a 3-piece, but they just still continue to impress, and they are one of the guiding lights, the leading lights of modern prog. At number 15, we're going back to the golden era. We're talking about Renaissance. Yeah, it's about time we get a female singer on this list. The first 2 Renaissance albums were basically just 2 guys from the Yardbirds, Keith Reeve and Jim McCarty. Keith's wife, Jane, was part of it. Their third album is when they did a whole lineup change and they brought in Annie Haslam on vocals, John Tout, Michael Dunford, John Camp, and Terry Sullivan on drums. They utilized during their best albums a poet for their lyrics, a girl named Betty Thatcher Newsinger, and her lyrics are just incredible. But that run of albums with that band, you had Prologue in 72, Ashes of Burning in 73, Turn of the Cards in 74, Scheherazade in 75, Novella in 77. These are just great albums. They put out a couple more good proggy albums in the late 70s, and then the 80s came, and you know what happened. You know exactly what happened. But I love Renaissance. They brought that medieval sound. There's not a lot of guitar, so the bass playing of John Kemp has a lot of space, and Annie Haslam's voice, forget about it. One of the greatest singers of all time. At number 14, we're talking about Transatlantic. Prayers that Transatlantic is not done. Tweets from Mike Portnoy and Neil Moore seem to indicate that it is the case, that there will be no more Transatlantic, and that is just a terrible fate. The greatest supergroup of all time. Sorry, ELP. No. But formed by Neil Morse, Mike Portnoy, and Pete Trewavas. Originally, they wanted the Fates Warning guitar player, Jim Matheos, in the band. He was busy, so they went with Roy Nastalt, and they put out 5 incredible albums. The great debut came out in 2000. The sophomore album was even better, Bridge Across Forever. Then they broke up for a little bit when Neil found God. They came back and did The Whirlwind in 2009, Kaleidoscope in 2014, and what appears to be their final album last year's The Absolute Universe. Let's hope not, because I love Transatlantic. They are the best modern prog band out there. Not even close. At number 13. Talk about foundational stuff right here. It's the Moody Blues, formed in Birmingham in 1964 by Mike Pinder, Ray Thomas, and Graham Edge. Denny Lane was in an early version of the band, and they did an album called The Marvelous Moodies. We don't even really include that as a Moody Blues album, do we? That core 5 lasted for the great 7-album run, which started in 67 with Days of Future Past, In Search of a Lost Chord in 69, On the Threshold of a Dream, and To Our Children's Children, Question of Balance in 70, Every Good Boy Deserves Favor in 71, and The Seventh Soldier in 72. That 7-album run is just amazing. They put out Octave a couple years later, not as good. Mike Pinder leaves the band. Patrick Moraz joins. He's on 4 albums. He got dissed by them pretty hardcore, but the Moody Blues is one of those bands that, without whom we probably would not be talking about prog rock. They're that important to the development of our genre. I just love them. Yeah, at number 12. Andy Latimer and Camel gets a little peep here. Formed in Surrey in 1971, so they were a little late to the game. Some people lump them in the Canterbury group of bands. They're adjacent. They're Canterbury adjacent for sure, but they have a little more symphonic to them. Their first album dropped in 73, and it was really, really good. You had Andy Latimer, Andy Ward, Peter Bardens, and Doug Ferguson. Over the years, you've had a lot of different people coming in and out of this band. People like Mel Collins, Richard Sinclair, David Sinclair, Kit Watkins from Happy the Man, Tom Scherpenziel from Kayak, Peter Jones is now in the band, Tiger Moth Tales and Cyan. Yeah, but things got really good after that debut. 1974's Mirage, my favorite album from them, just incredible. 1975, the instrumental music from The Snow Goose. 1976, Moon Madness, just amazing with that incredible song, Lunar Sea. 77, Rain Dances was good. They had one really strong album in the 80s called Nude, and then their last album came out in 2002, Not in a Wink, which is okay, but you take the entirety of Camel's discography, yeah, they totally deserve to be number 12 on this list. Just an amazing band. At number 11, this one kind of makes me a little sad, brings a tear to the eye to rank them this low, but it's Graaf Generator, formed in Manchester in 1967 by the great Peter Hamel. Most of their albums, he's joined by Hugh Banton on keyboards, Guy Evans on drums, David Jackson, the early years on saxophone, and for a couple albums they had Nick Potter on bass. Their debut album came out in 69, The Aerosol Gray Machine. I guess it was supposed to be a Peter Hamel solo album. 1970 saw The Least We Can Do Is Wave at Each Other. Also H to the HE came out in 70, but it was 1971's Pawn Hearts that got everybody crazy, featuring guest musician Robert Fripp on there. Then the band broke up, but they came back super strong in 75 with God Bluff, followed that up in 76 with 2 albums, Still Life and World Record, and then 77 saw Quiet Zone Pleasure Dome, just a really great record that showed the band moving in some different and crazy directions. If you take the band of Graaf Generator discography, combine it with the Peter Hamill solo discography, which I encourage people to do because it's primarily the same musicians on all these records, and you've got yourself a body of work that is pretty much second to none, and thus why the tear was shed at its low ranking. At number 10, it's Marillion, boys and girls. The band that saved Prog, formed in 1979. They were called the Silmarillion from a J.R.R. Tolkien book. They rounded out their early lineup with Fish on vocals, Mick Pointer on drums, Steve Rothery on guitar, Mark Kelly on keyboards, and Pete Trewavas on bass. Obviously, after the first album, Mick Pointer left and Ian Mosley's been on drums ever since. After the 4th album, Fish left and Steve Hogarth took over. But it's those first 4 albums that most prog fans hold real close to their heart. The debut album came out in 83, Script for a Jester's Tear, Misplaced Childhood came out in 85. Clutching at Straws in 87, then Fish was gone. The Hogarth years have seen some really strong records, though. It's been more hit and miss, but 1994's Brave, incredible. 2004's Marbles, might be my favorite Marillion album. 2016's Fear, and just this past year, you had this incredible album come out called An Hour Before It's Dark, just an incredible record. These guys are not done. They just keep going and going. I love Marillion. At number 9, let's go to Kansas, boys and girls. This was a band that was formed in the heartland of America. This is one of the bands that's the reason why I love prog so much, that you take the idea of British European prog rock and you add to it some local flavor, and that's exactly what you have with Kansas. That violin of Robbie Steinhardt, you know it's Kansas as soon as you hear it. You know it's American right away. That's what I love about these guys. They were formed from the ashes of all these different bands that were going on. There's a band called Saratoga. There's a band called White Clover. Kerry Livgren was in a band called Reasons Why. But I guess it all came together. All these guys finally formed a band called Kansas, and they started playing some local shows, and some dude that worked for Don Kersner went and saw him and signed him. And that incredible 1974 debut, man, is one of my favorite albums of all time. It's actually probably my most listened to album ever. The following year, they released Song for America and Mask. 1976, their masterpiece, Leftovertures, with the big hit Carry On Wayward Son. 77, you had Point of No Return with a big hit, Dust in the Wind. In 79, they did Monolith, their last great album. 1980, Audio Visions came out, and a couple decent songs, but you could see the band was winding down. People were getting into some different stuff. I guess Carrie and Dave Hope were really getting into Jesus, and Steve Walsh was still loving his cocaine, so things were it was gonna end badly. They put out a bunch of really bad records, but they are back now with a new lineup. Phil Earhart and Rich Williams being the only 2 original members left in the band, but you got the great Tom Brislin in the band now, who's done time with Yes and Renaissance. So the future of Kansas does look bright. Let's hope it stays that way. You know, they've got a couple guys that have been in the band forever. You've got Billy Greer's been in the band since 85, and David Ragsdale since 91. So it's a legitimate band that's on the road. Go see them if you get a chance. At number 8, it's Rush, formed in Toronto by Jeff Jones. Huh? Who's he? John Rutsey, yeah, okay, I remember him, and Alex Lifeson. Obviously, Jeff Jones was fired within a couple of weeks and replaced by Geddy Lee. John Rutsey lasted for 1 album as diabetes caused him to quit the band after the debut, But yeah, in 1975, Neil Peart joins the band, and that year they released two really cool albums, Fly By Night, Caress of Steel, and then 76, 2112 comes out. They'd been given an ultimatum by the record label, sell some records or hit the bricks. So instead of going for hits, they do a sidelong epic. Oh man, I love Rush. Oh man. 77, A Farewell to Kings, 78, Hemispheres, 1980, Permanent Waves, 81, Moving Pictures, 82, Signals. Man, from Caress of Steel to Signals, Rush was my favorite band for a long time. I just love them. 19 albums in, all 19 are good. They've had 7 Grammy nominations, but they never won one. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2013, and we all remember Alex Lifeson's Blah, Blah, Blah. The great Professor Neil Peart left us January 7th of 2020. A great loss to all music fans around the world. At number 7. Let's go with Gentle Giant, my friends, from the ashes of Simon Dupree and the Big Sound, a band that had one big hit in the UK. They toured with a guy named Elton John. They hated that song so much that Simon Dupree and the Big Sound broke up, and the three Shulman brothers, Ray, Phil, and Derek decided to go undercover and record a single called The Moles. The song was called We Are the Moles, part 1 on side A, part 2 on side B, and the rumor mill was going overtime that this was actually the Beatles with Ringo singing lead, but it was the great Syd Barrett that called him out and made sure the whole world knew now. Now, this is not the Beatles, this is Simon Dupree and the Big Sound. Gentle Giant was formed in 1970 when the Shulman brothers decided to bring in the Royal Academy of Music alumni Carrie Manier on keyboards and Gary Green on guitar. They went through a couple drummers, but by the time the 4th album came around, they had the right guy, John Weathers. Wow. Oh man, this band is just crazy how good they are. Yeah, the older brother left after Octopus came out in 72. The Glass Houses came out in 73. In a Glass House, I'm sorry. I'm not talking about Billy Joel here. We're talking about Gentle Giant. 1974, The Power and the Glory, kind of their Watergate album. 1975's Freehand, such an amazing record. I love it so much. Probably my favorite. And then 76 Interview was a fine, fine record. Their last 3 were not as good, but at least they ended on a fairly high note with 1980's Civilian. If you like your prog deep and complicated and medieval and just crazed, it's Gentle Giant, my friends. I love them so much. At number 6, we're in the big 6 now, kids. It's Jethro Tull, formed in 1967 in Blackpool by one Ian Anderson. He decided real early on that he wanted to be a rock star, and he just didn't want to be another third-rate guitar player. So he scanned the horizon. It's like, how can I stand out? What can I do? Let's take some flute lessons. Oh man, is there any more iconic image in the history of rock music than Ian Anderson on stage on one leg playing that flute? I don't think so. 1968, this was their debut album with Mick Abraham on guitar. It was a bluesy affair. He left the band and formed Bloodwood Pig, and they went through a lot of different guys trying to find the right guy, including the nicest Davey-O List. Mick Taylor was auditioned also. Famously, Tony Iommi from Black Sabbath was in the band for about a week. But they finally got the right guy in Martin Barr, who's been with the band ever since, except for that last album that came out this year. A 1969 stand-up, what a huge improvement over the debut. Aqualung came out in 71. 1972, their masterpiece, Thick as a Brick, one of the greatest albums ever. A Passion Play in 73. And then they just kept putting out good record after good record, man. War Child in 74. Minstrel in the Gallery, 75. Too Old to Rock and Roll in 76. Songs from the Woods, 77. Heavy Horse in 78. Stormwatch, 79. A in 1980. They won a Grammy in 1987 for Crest of the Knave, and Metallica fans still are salty about it. Yeah, Jethro Tull. I just remember Owen Wilson in that movie Armageddon talking about his greatest pet peeve of all is people mistaking Jethro Tull for Ian Anderson. It's a ridiculous thing, but why not? At number 5, I'm going with Emerson, Lake and Palmer. ELP was formed in London in 1970, but the genesis of the band goes back before then. I guess the Nice and King Crimson had been doing a couple dates together in the U.S., and Keith Emerson was getting tired of the Nice. Greg Lake was getting tired of King Crimson, so they started talking about forming a band, and they landed on Carl Palmer, who was with Atomic Rooster, had just recorded their debut album. Their second gig was at the Isle of Wight in front of 650,000 people. They have sold 45 million albums. They've got 9 gold records. Their first album came out in 70. 71 was Tarkus. 72 Trilogy. 1973, The Great Brain Salad Surgery. That run of albums is as good as anybody ever did. The reason they're only at number 5 on this list is it didn't last. They could never reproduce the magic from the early 70s. Even though they did a couple decent records later on, nothing ever could top that. And we're going to number 4 now. The biggest selling prog band of all time with over 250 million albums sold. Yeah, Pink Floyd is not a capital P prog. Their first couple albums are very psychedelic. They turned into a huge band, one of the biggest bands on the planet. But, they did release a lot of really progressive stuff, starting with Metal in 1971. Dark Side of the Moon, 1973, of course. One of the biggest selling albums of all time, in the top 5, right up there with Thriller and Saturday Night Fever. 1975, Wish You Were Here. 1977, Animals. They did the big double album, The Wall, in 79 with the movie and all that. 1983, the final cut came out, and that was it for Roger Waters. He was done. The band soldiered on with David Gilmour in the lead, but it is those classic 70 albums, those 70s prog albums that Pink, yes, they are prog. Those records were prog. Yeah, the early ones were not. Later on, maybe they got away, from the prog, but Dark Side, Metal, Wish You Were Here, Animals, that's prog. And yeah, they're number 4 on my list. At number 3. It's King Crimson, formed in London in 1968. Robert Fripp, Michael Giles, Greg Lake, Peter Sinfield, and Ian McDonald, the guy who would later on form Foreigner, which is just kind of a weird thing. But the Giles, McDonald, and all that stuff that was going on before King Crimson, I guess they bought a couple of Mellotrons, and they decided that they were going to try to do things a little bit different than any other band. The word is that the guys from Yes went to go see an early King Crimson concert, and after the end of it, they're like, man, we need to practice more. That epic debut, 1969's In the Court of the Crimson King, with that amazing album cover, shocked the world. The follow-up in 1970, In the Wake of Poseidon, a little bit of a letdown. They went through a real experimental period with Lizard and Islands, but then Fripp brings a whole new version of the band back with Bill Bruford on drums and John Wetton, and they released 3 of the best albums ever recorded. Lark's Tongue's an Aspect in 1973, Starless and Bible Black and Red in 1974, and then once again Fripp disbands the group. They come back in 1981 with Discipline, with Tony Levin and Adrian Belew. Then they go through a couple more changes. They do a double trio lineup where you've got 2 drummers, 2 guitar players, 2 bass players. The latest incarnation had 3 drummers up front. Oh, King Crimson is just one of the formational bands, one of the most important bands of all time, and I love every era of King Crimson. They're all different, and they're all amazing. And number 2. This one was hard. It's a toss-up. It's a toss-up. It's not a toss-up. Number 2's Genesis, formed at the Charter House in 1967. There were a couple different bands in that little school. There's one called Anon with Anthony Phillips and Michael Rutherford. Then there was another band called Garden Wall with Peter Banks and Tony Banks and Peter Gabriel. At some point, Jonathan King comes to the school. He was an alumni of the Charter House, and he talks to the boys, and they give him a demo. He agrees to manage them and produce their debut album, gets them a record deal, and that first Genesis album came out in '69, From Genesis to Revelation. It wasn't very good. Trespass was a big improvement, and then Anthony Phillips left the band. They took the opportunity to hire Steve Hackett and Phil Collins, and then the run of greatness was just unimpeded. 1971 Nursery Crime, 72 Foxtrot, 73 Selling England, 1974 The Lamb, 1976 you had the first of the post-Gabriel albums with Trick of the Tail. Later that same year, Wind and Wuthering came out. Steve Hackett leaves, and they still were able to put out a couple of great albums, 1978's, and then there were 1980's Duke. And then they get into their pop era, and I don't have a problem with those records either. Abacab, Genesis, Invisible Touch, they're good records. They're just not super proggy. But when Genesis was at their proggiest best, the 5-man Genesis, there's only one band better. Only one. And you know who they are. You know who they are. It's Yes, ladies and gentlemen. Formed in 1968. Chris Squire was in some band called Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. And he was introduced to John Anderson, and they bonded over Simon and Garfunkel. They wanted to do a cool band with interesting instrumentation, but not letting the vocal side slide. Their first 2 albums came out with that original lineup. The third album saw the introduction of Steve Howe on the Yes album in 71, 72 with Fragile. Now you've got Rick Wakeman in the band. So that 5-piece, the Fragile 5-piece, went on and did Close to the Edge in 1972. Then Bruford left. Alan White joins, and they do Tales from Topographic Oceans in 73. Then Wakeman leaves, and Mraz comes in. They do Relayer. Wakeman comes back. They do Going for the One and Tormato. Wakeman and John Anderson leave, and they do Drama. You know, it just goes on and on and on. The revolving door of members is just ridiculous. It annoys me to no end. It's the one thing about Yes that does bother me. I wish they had a little bit more of that core lineup. You know, so here we are today. You got Steve Howe's band still going with Billy Sherwood and Jeff Downs and John Davison and them people, but we really need John Anderson, Rick Wakeman, and Steve Howe to just bury the hatchet and get together and do one more album. Because if you look at Yes's last album, The Quest, Steve Howe's last solo album, Love Is, John Anderson's last solo album, 1,000 Hands, and Rick Wakeman's last solo album, The Red Planet, you put those 4 albums together and you've got a masterpiece. I swear you do. So I'm a little frustrated with Yes. I always have been. They're the band that I love to hate, but they are the pinnacle of prog, and I do have them at number 1. And I think you guys probably already figured that out. Anyway, have a great day. I love you. This was a lot of fun. I'll be seeing you guys very, very soon. Have a great one. Peace.